everything about phaser workflow in 2025, plus my template phaser Basepack free for you to download. Stay tuned. Back in 2021, that was on software version 1.6, I made a live stream where we talked about phasers and how to create them in great detail. So if you haven't seen this one, please make sure to check it out. I'll put a link right up there in the corner. And even though many concepts and aspects of handling phasers are still the same, of course, many things also have changed since version 1.6. So today's video is not only meant to be an update, but also we're going to talk less about how to create phasers in the first place, but more specifically about how to handle them in recipes, presets, and cues, and how to adjust and modify them later in an easy but yet effective way. My goal for today will be to systematically dissect all the different workflows and point out pros and cons and give you real world examples of when to use which workflow along the way. If you're interested in topics all around lighting design and programming, there's much more coming up on this channel, so please consider subscribing, activate the bell, and maybe even leave a like or a comment. As I already said, the main focus for today will not be how to create the actual phasers in the first place, but instead we will use a set of basic template phasers that I created for my shows and that I provide free for you to download. And of course, I'll put a link down in the video description. Along with those basic phasers come a set of handy little macros that I use to further modify those templates, either before putting the actual information into my cue lists or to update them later, for example, when doing production rehearsals or the first shows of a tour. And this is the schedule for today. First, we will do a quick recap of my last stream on phasers. Then I will show you how to import my base phaser pack and the modifier macros. And then, and that's the focus point of today's video, will be the comparison of different workflows outlining the pros, the cons, and the use cases. This was the main slide of the stream that I did about phasers back in software version 1.6. And as I said, many things are still the same. For example, the first step always is creating universal template phasers, and the second step is modifying them and then applying them to presets, to recipes within presets, and then storing them into your cues. And as I said, many aspects are still the same. However, many details have changed, as you will see in just a minute. Once you have downloaded the files, you should have two XML files, that is the phaser Basepack itself and the phaser modifier macros. And the first thing to do is to put those two XML files into the grandMA3 folder structure. I would recommend to use an external USB stick for this, because this way you will have it on your USB stick and you can use them with every future show file that you run into. So you want to put those two XML files in the grandMA3 library and data pools folder, and there you put the phaser Basepack into the presets folder. Just drag and drop it over, and the phaser macros into the macros folder. From there, let's hop into grandMA3. Here you want to go to the menu, show creator, hit import, and let's start with the macros. Select the drive. In my case, I have stored it to an external USB drive. Select the phaser macros XML, select a starting point, and hit import. From here, just go back, go to presets, and we are on the correct drive. So this is the phaser Basepack. Once again, we will specify a starting point. And of course, you have to choose a pool first. I have a dedicated all pool for my template phasers. And I just picked the first pool number. And I would encourage you to include the gaps for the template phasers, because as you can see, then you will have imported a few gaps here, and it makes sense once you see it, because then it is organized in those kind of rows. Let's talk about this view that I have set up very briefly. This is my main phaser editing view, and I use it more or less in this same way in all my shows. And it is basically representing my workflow. So from top to bottom, I start with selecting a group. Then I choose a template phaser, a universal template phaser. I might modify this template with my modifier macros, more on this in just a minute. And then I hit it with an MA3 pool item or with the MA3 editor. And from there, I might store it as a song phaser. I call it song phaser because those are specific phasers that I create for specific parts of a song. And from there, I will store it into a sequence. And of course, also I opened up a recipe editor, since this is a very effective tool that we got in software version 2.2. And of course, we also will make use of this today. Before we finally start talking about the actual phaser workflows, I want to explain this table, because this is the focus point of today's video. And this is what I created to dissect the different workflows. So there is different steps you have to follow for each approach, up to 5 steps. And then there is 3 main criteria that are important for me and for my programming. And that is dynamic selection, MA3 adjustable, and values adjustable. Those are the 3 main aspects that we are concentrating on today. What do I mean with dynamic selection? Basically, I want to create a phaser and later swap out the fixtures in my group, maybe having more fixtures than I programmed with, and the phaser should be updating dynamically. Basically, it's just a fancy word of saying I want to having my phaser handled by a recipe, right? So this is meant with dynamic selection. Then MA3 adjustable means I want to adjust the MA3 of my phaser, meaning the phase, the speed, the wings, the groups, maybe the shuffle value. And ideally, I want to do this in one place. So I want ideally have a preset where the MA3 is stored in and where I can do this at one point and then having it applied to the phasers that I use within my cue lists. The third point is values adjustable. And this, in my opinion, is the most overlooked one so far, because I think there is no great UI in grandMA3 so far to do this. And this is the main part of why I created my modifier macros. What do I mean by values adjustable? So I'm thinking about low and high values of a dimmer phaser, for example, or I'm talking about the colors, the actual colors of a color phaser, or the size of a position phaser. So basically what in grandMA2 terms would be the form of a phaser or the actual presets that are embedded within my effect line. So this is the 3 focus points that I would want to concentrate on. And ideally, of course, I want to have a workflow that fulfills all 3 of those criteria. So I want to have a dynamic selection, MA3 adjustable, and the values adjustable. Ideally, concentrated in one preset at one point where I can adjust those things globally and having it applied to my phaser wherever I have stored it. Without further ado, let's talk about the first workflow. So the first workflow will be to choose a template phaser, apply MA3, and store it in a queue. Very simple, very easy. For this example, I will pick my LED bars and I will choose a PWM. So just a quick explanation of what those phasors mean. For each form, sine, ramp, and PWM, I have 3 different versions that are different width of effect, right? So I'll just apply a phase of 360, and you can see this is the PWM 1/2. This is the PWM 1/3. So there is less fixtures being on at the same time. And this is the PWM 1/4. Back in my oldest stream, I did this with like the relative layer. But since I use relative values for different things now, I changed to using different amounts of steps. And this way also those icons very clearly indicate what's going on, right? So that's just a quick explanation. And you can, of course, also choose a sine form, maybe make it a little bit faster, maybe making it a wing of 2. And maybe I want to run the phaser from inside out. So I would change the phase to -360. And once I'm happy with the looks, I will just go and store it into a queue. I have prepared a few sequences here, so I'll just override it to get rid of any information that was stored in there before and clear the programmer and having a look at the phaser. So as you can see, the workflow is very easy, very quick, and you can create lots of different phasers in a very short amount of time. However, it is very hard to modify the phaser later because all the MA3 information that we entered is lost. And I mean, in principle, you could edit this queue and bring the information back into the programmer, like not the MA3 information, but the rest, and modify it from there. But in my opinion, it is not recommendable to do this because now I just have the phaser values in the queue, but maybe you also have other information about other groups of fixtures. Maybe there's position information in there. And by bringing the information back into the programmer, it gets messy quite quickly. To summarize, we have no dynamic selection with this approach, obviously, because we did not make use of recipes. And also, the MA3 is not adjustable later because basically at the point where we stored the information into the queue, the MA3 information got lost. Values adjustable, as I said, well, in principle, you could try to adjust them, but I would not recommend it. This is a very quick and dirty approach, and I would really suggest to use this only if you're really up against the clock, if you're really have to program something and get something out in a very short amount of time. And that's very important, only if you're really on the actual rig itself. So for example, if you're doing a TV show or a corporate event, basically a one-off where you need to come up with some looks very quickly, and you know, once the cues got fired, you'll never have to look at those effects again in the future. You could in principle use it, but of course I would not recommend it. Workflow number 2 will make use of the new recipe editor that came with grandMA 2.2. So the first step is to activate the edit recipe function. Then again, we're choosing a template phaser, applying MA3 and storing this into a queue. Activate the edit recipe functionality. As you can see, in all the pools, you can see the pod icon, the recipe icon in green. So you know that you're in the edit recipe mode. And from there, you would pick a group and choose an effect, for example, a ramp effect. And once again, hit it with a phase and with a wing. And here you can see, well, actually, this is a little bit different to how we worked without the recipe editor, because when you look at the recipe editor window, you can see that there is only one MA3 item active at a time because it references the item. You cannot combine different MA3 items, at least in software version 2.2. I would like to have an option within the MA3 pool that is called extract or something that basically does not reference the information of the pool item, but much rather extracts the information into the MA3 editor. But for now, once you're working with the edit recipe function, I would suggest to modify the MA3 within the MA3 editor only. So maybe put wings 0. And of course, once you have selected something, you can click again to deselect it. Right, so make it a phase of 360 and maybe make it a little bit faster. So for the sake of demonstration, let's say that is the phaser that we are after. We have entered the information into our recipe editor, and from there we just go and store it to a queue. Again, we'll store override it, clear the programmer, activate the queue, and there we go. When I look into this queue, you can see the recipe is here, and this way now we have referenced the group. That means that we have a dynamic selection. Dynamic selection is working. MA3 adjustable, of course, it's also adjustable because the MA3 is now living in that recipe line. However, I put it into brackets because if you imagine that I want to use this phaser over and over again, maybe this is the phaser for the chorus of my song, so I will copy it like 4 or 5 times, and now I want to change the speed for some reason or another. I would do this in every recipe line where I stored it in. So there's not a global point where I can modify the MA3, but I can modify it within each recipe line. And the values, they are not adjustable because I referenced the template phaser within the recipe line. That means that I only can choose another template, but I cannot really modify this template. So if I would like to have different low and high values, for example, I would have to modify my template phaser, which I definitely don't want to. MA3 is not referenced, as it has to be adjusted in every queue individually. Values not adjustable. Use case for me, this is the method that is great for busking shows and for start show files, because you can create a lot of cool looking phasers with just a very small amount of different template phasers. And since the selection is dynamically updated by changing the group, this is the best way of creating start show files, festival show files, and so on. Workflow number 3 starts with choosing a template phaser, applying MA3, and then storing it as a selective preset with embedded MA3. And this preset then we will call and store into a queue. For this example, let's exit the edit recipe functionality, choose our group, choose our template phaser, and I think now it's a good time to talk about my modifier macros. As I said, I use them to modify the specific values of my phaser. And for me, I'm mainly thinking about modifying the low and the high value of a dimmer phaser. So for this, I would call the dim low high macro, and it's asking me for a low value. For example, I want the low value to be 5% and the high value maybe to be 10%. So I will just have a very minor phaser that just creates some kind of glow. Please consider that those macros are specifically designed to work in conjunction with my template phasers. So you might not be able to use this with other phasers that you already got, but as long as you use it with my template phasers, it will work just fine. So with that said, let's go ahead and apply some MA3, some wings, apply the speed. And now you can see, well, that's maybe the effect is a little bit too less, and I want to make it a little bit bigger, the difference. So I can just recall the macro and maybe go between 5 and 20%. Let's see how this looks. Maybe just for the sake of demonstration, let's apply some Y matrix, maybe a phase of 360, just like so. And now, as I said, I want to store this as a preset, as a selective preset with matrix embedded. And you can either do this by pressing and holding the store key, activating matrix, and select preset mode selective. But you can also do this with this macro number 6, which is store selective matrix. So I'll just hit the macro, hit an empty pool item. Here we go. So now I can call this preset. And of course, at this point, I would encourage you to label it. And you don't have to hit assign or use the swipey, because there is this white frame around your preset. This means it is selected, and you can just name it selective phaser 1 and just click it again to call it into the programmer. And from there, we will store it into a queue. Let's clear the programmer and let's start the phaser. Well, now it is running, and now let's try to change the matrix. You cannot do this by calling the preset into the programmer and changing the matrix here. For some reason, it doesn't work, but you can just go edit settings, and in here, for example, we can get rid of our Y phase, which I don't like, to be honest. And you can see the phaser is updated. So maybe we want to make it wings of 4, and maybe we want to make it a little bit faster. Just like so. Perfect. So if I would like to edit the values, since it's a selective preset, I would just call the preset and I would hit my macro again. So maybe I want to having it run between 0 and 50%. Just like so. I just hit update, select my preset, clear out the programmer, and we're good to go. So as you can see, I can modify the matrix globally in one place, and I can modify the values themselves with the use of my modifier macros. However, it is a selective preset, and we did not make use of any recipes. That means it is not dynamically updating. To summarize workflow number 3, we have no dynamic selection, but we can adjust the matrix, and we can even do it in one place and use the phaser in different places in our show, and the values are adjustable. Of course, you do not have to use my modifier macros. You can do this with the steps editor or with the phaser editor itself. For me, it's just more handy and more convenient to have macros for me to do this. This is a very fast and I think creative workflow. It involves very little steps, and for me also it is very similar to a grandMA2 workflow, because you have a selective preset, which is more or less like a selective effect, where you can modify the wings, the phase, the speed. I can even modify the form or the low and the high value if I like to. And I have everything in one pool item at one place to modify it later. So this is more or less like a grandMA2 workflow. However, it is selective. That means it is not updating with changing the fixtures within your group. You would have to clone or something, and then you might have individual phase values as you would have in grandMA2. However, this approach is great for having queue listed shows, but only for full productions. Like when you know you will have the same rig over and over and over, you're not going to play any festivals, and you have the same fixtures, and even more important, the same amount of fixtures night after night, then this workflow is great. Workflow number 4 will once again make use of the recipe editor. From there, we will hit a template phaser, apply a matrix, and then we will create a recipe preset. Once again, we start by activating the edit recipe functionality. We choose our LED bars, we choose our template. Once again, you cannot combine different pool items, so we will apply the matrix in the matrix editor, choose a phase of 360 with a higher speed, and then maybe we go and also apply a Y phase of 360, also with a little bit faster speed, just like so. That looks great. And now we will store this into a preset. So as you can tell by the pod, we have created a recipe preset. So once you look into this preset, you can see we have now generated a recipe within our preset, and we can call the preset. Oh, sorry, we have to leave the recipe editor and have to call the preset. Let me clear again for a sec. Let's call the preset and we can store it into our queue, override it, clear the programmer, and let it run. So when we look into this queue now, you can see there is no recipe in the queue itself, but the preset consists of a recipe. The problem with that is, well, actually, there's two problems that I have with this workflow. The first is it is not really dynamically changing, because I will just take my mega pointer group and store override the LED bar group. And you will see that the phaser is still running on my LED bars. Why is that? It is because the recipe lives within the preset. It doesn't live within the queue. So it changes dynamically the preset, but it doesn't the queue. And for me, this is the point that I would want to being changed, right? So if I off my sequence and just call the preset, you can see the phaser is running on the mega points instead of the LED bars. However, this information is not forwarded into the queue, which, if you think about it, makes sense. But for me, this really is why I would not recommend using recipe presets, because the whole sense of a recipe is to have a dynamically changing selection, right? Another downside to this is now the effect is running. And if I want to, for example, make it slower, I could do this here, but you see it is not live updating, right? So you have to call the preset again for the changes to take place. To recap this workflow, we have a kind of dynamic selection, because when we change the selection, the preset changes. However, the information that we put in the queue is not dynamically updating. So for me, that does not really count. The matrix, of course, is adjustable. However, as you could see, it is not live updating. And the values, they are also not really adjustable, because once again, like in workflow number 2, we have referenced a template phaser. Of course, we could swap the template for another template, but that is not really what I want. So to summarize, the new selection is only referenced within the preset, but not the actual queue. And the preset, whenever you have it run in the programmer, is not live updating. For me, the only use case really is if you want to combine multiple phasers in one preset, then you can do this by using multiple recipe lines within the preset. However, I would always try to avoid it if possible. Workflow number 5 is a cool approach that I saw Jason Giaffo doing on his YouTube channel in a recent video where he also talked about phaser workflows. And so I decided that it is a good idea to also include it into my comparison here. His workflow would be to start with a template phaser, apply MA3, and then storing it as a universal preset with MA3 embedded, then going to turn this into a recipe preset and storing this into a queue. For this example, let's talk about color phasers for a second. And I will just bring the dimmer on of my LED bars, pick the group, and pick one of my 3 color phasers. And as you can see, the Basepack only consists of 3 different color phasers, but you can choose the color with the color low-high macro. In this case, we are not entering specific values, but we are referencing color presets. So if I want to run the phaser between like blue, I would hit 4, and for preset red, I choose number 2. And now you can see it is running between red and blue. And of course, even if you want to have a color phaser that is white and red, I would recommend to use this macro at first, because this way you're really referencing your color presets, which in most cases is what you really want. So with that said, once again, let's apply a phase, maybe of 30 degrees, and wings and speed. Okay, let's make it 180, just like so. And now we will store this as a universal preset with embedded MA3. Once again, you can do this with the store options, or you take this macro number 5, and just hit an empty pool item. You can see it is universal and it has embedded MA3. From here, we go to edit settings and hit the turn into recipe functionality. So we turned this preset into a recipe preset. However, as you can see here, we lost our selection. So we would have to again assign the LED bar selection to this. And now we are in kind of the same situation as we are in the workflow that we had before. That is that we have a selective preset, which has universal information in here. And you could argue that it is a little bit hard to modify the values of this. However, it is possible, and I will show you how to do it. And as I said, that is something that I have stolen from Jason Giaffo. You'd go to edit settings and then hit edit recipe 1. And unfortunately, you cannot see the result of what you're doing, because like internally, since it is universal data, it is just running on one preset where the universal data is virtually stored. However, you can reapply the color macro and, for example, choose green and white. So I would choose number 3. And by the way, the low value of the color phaser for me is always the darker preset. So green and white, number 1. And now you hit update. Okay, clear out. And you can see, I haven't stored it into, into my sequence so far. However, when I activate it, you can see, well, now it's running between white and green. And of course, we can store that into a queue, override. Also having the information updated. Right. To recap, we still have the same kind of dynamic selection because we have a dynamic selection internally within the preset. We can modify the MA3 and we can adjust the values. However, it is a little bit tedious. Jason Giaffo also did it with, like, on the way to updating, creating another preset for him to being able to really seeing the output. And yeah, the new selection only referenced within the preset, but not the actual queue. And it's also the same problem that the preset itself is not live updating. So for me, even though it's a cool approach and it's a great tool to know about, I personally would avoid this workflow, to be honest. Workflow number 4 and workflow number 5 both had the problem that the selection is just updating internally within the preset, but not the actual queue. And the next workflow number 6, will be a method of avoiding this problem. So we will start from workflow number 4 or number 5. That means we will have a preset that contains a recipe, and from there we will make use of the edit recipe functionality and create another recipe that contains the preset. So now we're really entering like the bit more complex stuff, because now we will create a recipe within a recipe, right? And this we will store into a queue. Just as an example, let's start with the color phaser that we created in workflow number 5. And I will hit edit recipe. I would select my group and I would select the preset. And now you can see it is a selective preset. We don't have any matrix information here because this matrix information lives within our preset, but we can store this to our queue. And I will once again just override the queue. And here you can see, well, we have our phaser running. And for the sake of demonstration, I will once again, I bring the dimmer on of my mega points, which at this point are just white, and I will override the LED bar group with the mega pointer group. So I hit this, say store, override, and you can see the moment I override the group, our phaser is dynamically being updated. This is a workflow that works quite well because now we have a real dynamic selection. However, the downside for me is that it just contains way too many steps and I have to assign the group 3 times. So just to recap, I'll just do it again real quick. Take the mega points and assign a dimmer phaser, assign wings, assign phase, assign a speed. Just like so, I will off the color phaser here. So, and maybe I want a shuffle value and I want it to be a bit quicker, just like this. Cool. And now I will store it as a universal preset with matrix embedded, like here. I'll go into the preset. I will convert it to a recipe. Now comes the second time where I have to apply the group, so the mega point group. And now I have to hit the edit recipe functionality. And for the third time, I have to select my group, then the preset. And this is the information that actually goes into my queue. And I can override the mega pointer group with my LED bar group. I have saved it here for a second time. So select it and store override the mega points. And you can see now the phaser is running on my LED bars. To recap, workflow number 6, we finally got a real dynamic changing selection. We have the matrix adjustable within the preset, and we have the values kind of adjustable in the same way as it was in workflow number 5. For me, it is kind of a convoluted workflow since, as you saw, the group has to be applied 3 times. Updating is kind of tedious and you actually cannot see the output while updating because you are just, the phaser is actually running just on one fixture internally. This is also a workflow that is great to know about, but I would try to avoid it. Finally, let's come to workflow number 7, the last workflow. And this maybe is my preferred method of working with phasers. We will start with a template phaser. We will apply a matrix and we will store it as a universal preset with a matrix embedded. And we will then activate the edit recipe function and creating basically a recipe. And this we will store into a queue. Let's start with the LED bars. And once again, let's choose a color phaser, for example, this one. And now let's choose two colors. For example, let's go blue and white. So my low value will be number 4, please. High value will be number 1. And we will apply a matrix once again, apply speed. Let's try something different here. How does that look? How about 90 degrees? How about more wings? Just like so. And more speed on the Y dimension. Yeah, I don't like it, but for the sake of demonstration, I think we're fine. And now I will store it as a universal preset with a matrix embedded. I use the macro here. And now I hit edit recipe. I have to reselect my group, reselect the preset, and it even embeds the matrix information into the recipe line. And this will be stored into our queue. So I can clear this out and start the queue. I can have a look here. We created a recipe line, but we are not referencing a template, but much rather our song phaser, which is also universal. And we have a referenced matrix item, which is the song phaser itself. So for example, I can go in here and remove the Y dimension of my phaser, remove the Y speed of my phaser, and making it wings of 0. Just like so. Maybe that is what I'm after. And also I can modify the values of my phaser. For this, however, you would have to reselect the group because, I mean, in principle, you could go edit and hit the preset. Then we're back to the method from before that the phaser actually is just running on one fixture. But if you don't have to see the output, you can do it. So for example, if I want to change the colors, I would hit my macro, go from red to white. Please, as you can see, you can't see it because it is just running on one of those pixels. But as soon as I hit update, it changes the color. But you can also do it by reselecting the group and reapplying the preset. And now you even can see what you're doing, maybe having it run from blue to green, whatever. I mean, it's just for the sake of demonstration. I hit red, not green. Let's make it correct. 4 and number 3. And just hit update, select the preset, and you are good to go. So I think this is my preferred method of doing it because we have a dynamic selection. Since we are using a recipe, we can update the matrix globally within our song preset, and we can adjust the values by recalling the preset and updating the values. This, at the point of the recording of this video, is my preferred method of handling phasers within queues. And I think it is the most flexible workflow because you are able to modify everything later on, all combined in one preset. And it is the most seamless workflow. Just a quick word on the phaser or the preset that we created that is universal, especially when working with dimmer phasers. You really want to be careful with calling this preset, because with like double tapping it and it being a universal preset, you would have every fixture in your rig running the phaser, which you definitely do not want, especially for me, as I'm using quite a lot of DMX remotes which are listening to dimmer channels. I don't want this to happen. So to avoid it, I would recommend to set the preset pool to being an add pool and not a self-fix add pool. So with that set, you cannot accidentally double tap the preset twice, but you always would have to make a selection first and then apply the preset. And for the sake of completeness, let's very briefly talk about position phasers, even though the workflow is more or less the same. Let's choose the mega points, and for example, let's hit a tilt phaser, and now we want to maybe adjust the size of it. So I would choose my tilt low high modifier macro, maybe make it a value of -5 and 20. So just quite a small range, and then applying MA3 and a bit faster. That's too fast. Just like so. And now we will store it as a universal phaser with embedded MA3. Hit the edit recipe function, recall the group, recall the preset, and store it into a queue override. And now we have a working position phaser. If I want to modify the size of it, I would reselect my group with the edit recipe functionality being deactivated, recall the group, recall the preset, and reset my macro, for example, to minus, let's do -30, 30. Just like so. So now you can see the effect is much bigger than before. Just hit update, clear out, and you have it updated. Maybe now I decide, well, this is too quick. I would go into the edit settings and slow the phaser down. And there you go. Of course, this is not meant to be a complete list, because grandMA3 is just way too complex and there's always another workflow out there waiting for you. And that's the reason why I would be very interested in your opinion. What is your preferred workflow when it comes to working with phasers? Please leave a comment down below. And as I said, if you're interested in those kind of topics, then please consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.